Plato also draws an important distinction between true belief and knowledge. A person may have a belief that happens to be true, and that belief may guide action correctly, but the true belief is unstable. Here, Einstein became crucial. He challenges two major modern methods of grounding knowledge, that is, simple induction and strict deduction. So, skepticism brings us back to the central question: where does reasoning end? Skeptic argues that opposing views can often be made to appear equally convincing. Instead of choosing one side dogmatically, skeptics recommends suspending judgment, which Greeks call epoche. Even if an evil demon is deceiving me, if I am being deceived, then I must exist to be deceived. If I doubt, then I must exist to doubt. Even if all my thoughts are false, this remains certain: I am thinking. Hello, namaskar, adab, vanakkam. Today's lecture is Brief History of Epistemology. In his famous essay on What There Is, the radical naturalist Willard von Orman Quine begins with a simple question. He asks, what is there? His equally famous answer is, to be is to be the value of a variable. For Quine, existence is decided by what our best theory says there is. In other words, ontology depends on the commitments of our best system of knowledge. In our lecture today, Quine's question, what there is, leads to a different one. That is, how can we know what is there at all? This is where epistemology begins. The word epistemology is relatively recent when compared with the long history of philosophy. In the 17th and 18th centuries, philosophers did not yet use one single standard term for what we now call epistemology, but the subject itself was already central. Locke, Berkeley, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, among others, were deeply concerned with knowledge. They asked about its nature, its sources, its limits. We can see this concern in works such as Locke's essay concerning human understanding, Berkeley's A Treatise concerning principles of knowledge, principles of human knowledge, Hume's Inquiry concerning human understanding, Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. The term epistemology was later introduced by Scottish philosopher James Ferrier. He derived it from a Greek word episteme, which means knowledge. Epistemology begins by asking a simple but basic question, such as what is knowledge? What are the means by which we know? Does knowledge come from the senses, from reason, or from both? Can human beings ever reach certainty? Are there final limits to what we can know? And if there are those limits, how can we know those limits? In philosophy, we can distinguish three kinds of knowledge. The first kind of knowledge is knowledge by acquaintance, which is direct familiarity with something we experience. For example, you know the taste of mango because you have eaten it before. Second is knowing how, which is the ability to perform an activity such as knowing how to play tennis. The third is knowing that, or knowing that P, which concerns facts expressed in statements. For instance, you know that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. This last kind of knowledge, namely propositional knowledge, is the primary focus of epistemology. In this lecture today, I want to address epistemological questions through a brief historical survey of major theories in Western philosophy concerning propositional knowledge. Given this is a brief survey of history, my aim is very specific. I want to trace the general movement of epistemology from Plato and Aristotle in the ancient times to Gettier challenge in the last century. So, let's begin with the ancients. In Western philosophy, the search for what knowledge is begins in Greece. Although the classical Greek philosophers pursued abstract theories, Their work was ultimately oriented towards the ethical questions of how one should live. Before Plato, the early Greek thinkers, usually called pre-Socratics, were mainly concerned with large questions about nature and the cosmos. They asked what everything is made of, how nature works, what reality is like. In that sense, they were doing metaphysics and cosmology more than epistemology. Still, we find early epistemological insights in Heraclitus and Parmenides, the two of the most important pre-Socratics. Heraclitus is associated with the thought that one cannot step in the same river twice. This image, this picture, expresses the constant flux of the sensory world and raises a problem about knowledge. That is, how can knowledge be stable if the world given it to perception is always changing? Parmenides moves in the opposite direction. For him, genuine knowledge must concern what does not pass away. Therefore, the changing world of perception cannot give us stable knowledge. Now, coming to Plato, Plato is arguably the first major philosopher to place the question of knowledge within a more systematic framework. In the Meno, Socrates speaks with an uneducated boy. The Meno, his dialogue, Plato's dialogue Meno, where Socrates speaks with an enslaved boy and leads him through questioning towards a geometrical truth. Here, Socrates draws the answer out of him. From this, Plato suggests that soul of the boy, which is the real knowing subject, already has this knowledge but has forgotten it. What we call learning is not acquisition of new information, new data, but recovery of knowledge already present in the soul. This is Plato's theory of recollection, or it is called anamnesis in Greece. This idea is further developed in the Phaedo, where Plato argues that soul exists before the body and survives after the body. Because the soul exists before birth, before the body ever comes into existence, Plato thinks it can bring knowledge with it into embodied life. This idea is later fed into the doctrine of innate knowledge, that is, the claim that mind possesses certain truths independently of sense experience, independently of our experience of day-to-day life. Plato also draws an important distinction between true belief and knowledge. A person may have a belief that happens to be true, and that belief may guide action correctly, but the true belief is unstable. It can, so to speak, run away. Knowledge, by contrast, is tied down by an account or explanation. Plato returns to this issue in Theaetetus, his new dialogue, where he examines the proposal that knowledge is true belief plus logos. The dialogue, Theaetetus, formally ends without a final accepted definition, and many scholars read it as aporetic. However, some scholars argue that ending is not philosophically barren, because in their interpretation, Plato rejects foundationalist model of logos and signals towards more interrelational or coherentist account of knowledge. In modern terms, Plato's idea of account or logos is close to what later philosophers call justification. Justification means the reason or explanation that grounds or ties down a true belief and allows it to count as knowledge. From this comes the famous account of knowledge as justified true belief. Much later, in 1963, Edmund Gettier challenged this traditional account by showing that belief can be true and justified, yet still fail to constitute as knowledge. In the Republic, Plato's arguably the most famous dialogue, Plato investigates the question of justice. But from the chapters 5 to 7, that question leads him into epistemology, that is, what must we know to live in a just society? Here he separates knowledge from opinion, and this distinction is grounded in ontology, that is, the difference between intelligible world and the sensible world. Opinion belongs to the visible and changing world, known through the senses. Knowledge, by contrast, aims at what is invisible and unchanging. That is why the highest objects of knowledge are the forms that are eternal realities, such as justice itself, beauty itself, or equality itself. For Plato, what is most real is also what is most knowable. Plato explains this hierarchy through the divided line analogy. He separates diaonia or discursive reasoning from noesis or direct understanding. Mathematics belongs to diaonia. It is higher than sense-based opinion, but it still begins with hypotheses taken as starting points. Those are called also first principles. Above diaonia stands noesis, the highest level of understanding. Here, at the level of noesis, soul rises beyond hypothesis towards first principles and ultimately towards the form of the good. Plato explains the good through the sun analogy. Just as the sun makes sight possible in the visible world, the good makes knowledge possible in the intelligible world. To understand the forms, consider a table, ordinary table. We see many different tables, yet we call them all table. In modern logical language, we might say X is a table, functions as a predicate applied to many objects. But Plato's point goes further than predication. Here he thinks these objects are intelligible as tables because they participate in a deeper reality, that is form of the table or tableness itself. The forms are not physical objects, they are eternal and stable realities, and their stability is what makes genuine knowledge possible. The method Plato proposes for reaching these forms is dialectic or dialectical method. Dialectic is careful questioning and reasoning that moves beyond examples towards underlying reality. Yet Plato often raises these questions without offering a definitive settled definition. He shows us the need for an ultimate answer, but he does not always give us complete formula. This open-ended search became one of philosophy's great inheritances. It is the attempt to find stable meanings, firm foundations, and timeless forms beneath the changing world of everyday life. Here, one point is especially worth noticing about the Republic. Plato's search for certainty in knowledge seems closely connected to his preference for stability in political life. In Open Society and Its Enemies, Karl Popper famously says that this is Plato's attempt to arrest change in politics. On Popper's reading, Plato wants to maintain virtue and social order by stopping historical and political change, and this is why Plato is a totalitarian, Popper says. Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar also offers a critique of Plato's political philosophy in his Annihilation of Caste. Ambedkar argues that the Republic treats human beings as if they could be neatly divided into unchanging social types, social classes. For Ambedkar, this kind of framework ignores the uniqueness and complexity of individuals. It can also become dangerous when it is used to justify rigid social order such as the caste system in India. Next in our line is Aristotle, who is Plato's most famous student, also his sharpest critiques. He opens the metaphysics with the famous line, "All men by nature desire to know," he says. This line shows Aristotle's project is centered around epistemology. His metaphysics and epistemology separates him sharply from Plato. In the metaphysics, Aristotle criticizes Plato's theory of transcendent forms. Aristotle says, the talk of things participating in forms amounts to empty words and poetic metaphors. I think this is his sharpest critique of forms. One of the sharpest objections is that forms do not really explain change. If the forms are eternal, unchanging, and separate from the world, how can they explain the realm of becoming where everything is in motion and new things come into being all the time? So Aristotle rejects Plato's forms as separate entities. For Aristotle, forms are not floating in the higher realm apart from the world. Still, like Plato, Aristotle thinks knowledge or episteme is directed toward form. By form, he means the essence or intelligible structure of a thing. What is fully real for Aristotle is the individual substance, such as this horse, this tree, or this person. Genuine knowledge begins with sensory experience of such particulars. But Aristotle does not treat individual things as imperfect copies that participate in separate form, like Plato. Instead, he sees each thing as composite of matter and form. For him, form is not outside the thing because it is immanent in the thing itself. That means it is the principle that makes the things what kind of thing it is. To understand Aristotle, let's take an example of a triangle. On Aristotle's view, our knowledge of a triangle begins with experience. We encounter many triangular things, and from them, the mind abstracts what they have in common. By contrast, for Plato, geometrical knowledge does not arise from sensory experience in this way. The triangles we see in the sensible world are only imperfect instances of intelligible reality apprehended by reason. So, in later philosophical language, we may say that Plato treats the geometrical knowledge something like a priori knowledge. Unlike Plato, Aristotle does not denigrate the senses. He leans more towards empiricism, but not in the later Lockean or Humean sense. For Aristotle, knowledge develops through a structured movement. It begins with particulars, but it becomes knowledge in the fullest sense only when mind comprehends universals. Aristotle sketches this development of knowledge in the metaphysics and also give a methodological form in his posterior analytics. Let us now see how, for Aristotle, the mind climbs this ladder toward knowledge. Aristotle rejects Plato's theory of forms and also theory of recollection, and he develops his own more experience-based account of knowledge. At the base of Aristotle's account of knowledge is perception or aesthesis. Perception is our direct awareness of particular things and events, such as this cat, this sound, this color, or this moving object. Aristotle begins with perception because the world appears to us through particulars. But perception by itself is not yet science. It tells us something is there, but it does not yet explain what it is or why it is so. Perception then makes memory possible or mneme possible. Memory allows us to retain what we have perceived after the object is no longer present in the perception. From many memories, experience or empiria begins to form. Experience gathers similar cases, so the mind begins to recognize patterns. From experience, the intellect or nous begins to comprehend what is universal in the experience. A universal is what is one across many cases. It is not another particular object floating somewhere. It is the common form or structure recognized in many particular things. The step is decisive for Aristotle, this step of comprehending the universals. Once mind apprehends the universals, it can move beyond this case or that case. It can begin to understand the whole class of things. Only then can knowledge begin to be formed or taught or demonstrated and organized into science or episteme. From universals, Aristotle says the mind reaches first principles. These first principles become the starting point of demonstration, or in other words, apodexis it is called in Greek. This is where science or episteme becomes possible. For Aristotle, scientific knowledge requires demonstration, but every demonstration must begin from starting points. But demonstrative reasoning cannot proceed through an infinite chain of regress, because each proof depends on prior premises. If every premise itself required another premise, another proof, we would be trapped in an infinite regress. Therefore, science must be founded on some starting points that are known but not proved in the way theorems are proved. These are called first principles, by the way. These starting points or foundational principles are apprehended non-demonstrably. This is a very important point. Here Aristotle gives one of the earliest arguments for foundationalism. Foundationalism is the view that some basic principles support the rest of our knowledge without themselves being derived from further propositions. In this respect, Aristotle and Plato share a common ambition. Both Plato and Aristotle seek a bedrock for knowledge. Though Plato looks beyond hypotheses to the good, Aristotle looks to the first principles known by the intellect. After Aristotle, the Hellenistic period was shaped by several major philosophical schools, especially the Epicureans, the Stoics, and the Skeptics. All three were deeply concerned with the questions of how one should live. For them, many philosophical problems were secondary to ethics. The Epicureans were strongly empiricist and strongly anti-skeptical. Their view was supported by an atomistic and materialistic metaphysics. They held that knowledge must begin from the sense experience. They also treated sensations, feelings, and preconceptions as basic criteria of truth. On the other hand, the Stoics were also empiricist in orientation, but they argued that knowledge requires more than mere sensation. The mind must give a rational assent only to genuinely cognitive impressions. That is, it must assent only to impressions that are present things as they really are. Among these Hellenistic schools, the skeptics made epistemology central to their approach. They were the most critical. Their final aim was still ethical. They sought ataraxia, that is, tranquility of mind, calm or peacefulness of mind. But they pursued this tranquility by attacking dogmatic claims to knowledge. A powerful challenge to foundationalism comes from Pyrrhonian skeptics. In the outlines of Pyrrhonism, Sextus Empiricus raises a disturbing question. By what criterion do we decide that a chain of supporting propositions has finally reached the bedrock? How do we know that a regress of reasons has finally stopped? And what, if anything, is genuinely self-evident? This Pyrrhonian attack strikes not only at Aristotle's first principles, but also at the very dogmatic claim and every dogmatic claim to an infallible foundation of knowledge. The skeptic asks, what makes a foundational proposition, the first principle, so certain that it needs no further support? If we stop the chain of reasoning at some basic proposition, the skeptic asks why we should stop there. The stopping point can seem arbitrary in skeptic's point of view. If we do not stop, the chain of reasons threatens to continue without limit, leading to an infinite regress. But if the chain turns back on itself, the argument becomes circular, like snake eating its own tail. So skepticism brings us back to the central question: where does reasoning end? Skeptic argues that opposing views can often be made to appear equally convincing. Instead of choosing one side dogmatically, skeptics recommends suspending judgment, which Greeks call epoche. Through this suspension, the Pyrrhonian skeptics seek ataraxia or tranquility of mind. Sextus describes the skeptical method like this, and I quote, "Owing to the equivalence among the things and statement thus supposed, we are brought first to epoche, that is, suspension of judgment, and then to ataraxia." What Sextus really means is that skeptic sets one claim against another until both seem equally balanced. When neither side clearly wins, the mind suspends the judgment. Here the goal is freedom from dogmatism, and with that, the tranquility of mind. In other words, the skeptic thinks peace comes from refusing to dogmatize where certainty cannot be secured. Sextus says that skepticism works by, and I quote, opposing to each statement an equal statement. With that, we can bring our discussion of the ancient philosophers to close and now turns to the moderns. If we look at the broad history of Western philosophy, the early modern period brings a major turning point. Before modernity, philosophy was largely focused on speculation in metaphysics and ontology. In the modern period, philosophical focus shifted more towards epistemology. The historic shift away from medieval thought was influenced by many forces, including Protestant Reformation in politics, the rise of modern science, and the weakening of Catholic Church's authority. Now, despite the power of skeptical arguments, the search for secure foundations in Western philosophy did not disappear. It continued into the early modern period, taking two major forms based on two methods that are empiricism grounded in induction and rationalism grounded in deduction. Empiricism based on induction continues an Aristotelian impulse. It was Francis Bacon who gave new importance to the method of induction. Induction moves from observations towards general conclusions, and this fits the empiricist idea that knowledge begins from sensory experience. On the other hand, rationalism based on deduction echoes a Platonic impulse. René Descartes argued for deduction. Deduction starts from first principles and reasons outward from them. This fits the rationalist idea that reason, not experience alone, can lead to certainty. Descartes and Bacon had their own methods and they were different, but their historical roles were very similar. Both rejected much of scholastic philosophy and its Aristotelian background. For that reason, both stand at the center of modern philosophy. However, historians generally regard René Descartes as the father of modern philosophy. He became the central figure of rationalist tradition. He believed that certain ideas are innate or inborn. This was especially important for the mathematics and the basic principles of reason. For Descartes, the success of mathematics and the new mathematical physics suggested something more profound. It suggested that human reason can, in principle, explain the universe. The mind can know the reality with certainty if it follows the right method. Pyrrhonian skeptics, he thought, were mistaken. The reasoning does not have to end in suspension of judgment. With the right method, reason can uncover the hidden structures of the world. In many ways, the confidence captures the spirit of enlightenment. However, I do not accept this confidence of enlightenment without criticism. In politics and society, this same idea of reason was often used to justify European colonial expansion. It was used to claim that Europe had the right to rule, classify, and civilize others. Coming back to Descartes, however, the confidence in reason also reveals Descartes' conception of truth. He thinks that mind's rational structures can serve as a reliable mirror of the world outside the mind. In that sense, he assumes a correspondence view of truth. That is, a thought is true when it agrees with or matches its object in the world outside the mind. He makes this clear in 1639 letter to a French mathematician Marie Mercier, where Descartes writes, "I have never had any doubts about the truth, because that word truth in the strict sense denotes the conformity of thought with its objects." According to Descartes, what is clearly and distinctly known by the faculty of reason cannot be false. He argues that error does not come from reason itself, but from the lack of method, and it was his method that made him distinctive. Like many philosophers before him, he sought infallible certainty. But unlike many before him, he tried to reach it through a systematic procedure. This project is presented most famously in his two books. The first is Discourse on Method and the second is Meditations on First Philosophy. Descartes' method is a method of doubt, often called Cartesian doubt. At first, this can sound like skepticism, but Descartes is not trying to remain in doubt forever. He is trying to defeat skepticism by using doubt against itself. He aims to find at least one single piece of knowledge that is completely certain. It must be something immune to skeptical attack. Once he finds that foundation, he can begin to rebuild knowledge from there. So, he decides to doubt everything that can be doubted. His rule is strict. If a proposition can be doubted even slightly, then we should treat it as a false for the purpose of finding certainty. He begins by doubting senses. The senses sometimes deceives us, he says. Therefore, any belief that depends on the senses is, at least in principle, uncertain. With this doubt, whole classes of ordinary beliefs are excluded from knowledge. Then Descartes pushes the doubt even further. He imagines an extreme possibility. What if a powerful evil demon is deceiving me about everything? He asks. What if I am deceived even about mathematics, which usually seems more certain? What if I am made to go wrong even when I add 2 and 2? With this possibility in place, even mathematics and logic are not spared. These are usually the strongest candidates for certainty, but now even they appear to be in doubt. But in the second meditation, in the middle of total skeptical wreckage, Descartes finds that foundational bedrock. He realizes that there is one thing even the evil demon cannot destroy. He cannot doubt his own existence while he is doubting. Pay attention to this. Even if an evil demon is deceiving me, if I am being deceived, then I must exist to be deceived. If I doubt, then I must exist to doubt. Even if all my thoughts are false, this remains certain. I am thinking. Descartes puts the point in this way in the second meditation, and I quote, "Having weighed all these considerations sufficiently, I can finally decide that this proposition, that is, I am, I exist, whenever it is uttered by me or conceived in the mind, is necessarily true." From this comes the very famous conclusion, I think, therefore I am, or cogito ergo sum. This becomes Descartes' first principle, the foundation from which he begins his philosophy. It is known a priori, which means it is not derived from sensory experience. It is understood by intellect with certainty. For Descartes, knowledge begins with the self or the I. Everything else is, at least at first, open to doubt. The senses therefore become less reliable as a source of knowledge. Therefore, Descartes gives the senses lower status in the search for certainty. To counter this, empiricism moves in the opposite direction. However, Francis Bacon was not responding directly to Descartes as Locke and Hume later did. Bacon belongs to the earlier formation of modern empirical inquiry. He is one of the major figures behind the modern scientific outlook. Where Descartes looks for certainty by beginning with reason, Bacon argues that inquiry must begin with the senses, especially with observation and experiment. Reason is still necessary, but it must be trained by method, it must be guided by induction, and it must be protected by the mind's natural errors, which Bacon called the idols. Bacon marks the major shift in the modern period by asking about the purpose of knowledge. He believed inquiry should go beyond metaphysical speculations and produce practical results. It should lead to discoveries and inventions that improve human life. His main goal was not to develop complete theory of knowledge as Locke and Hume did. Instead, he aimed to reform the way we investigate by replacing scholastic debate and early theorizing with the careful observations and induction. The guiding principle Bacon gives to empirical inquiry is that knowledge should aim towards, and I quote, industrious observations, grounded conclusions, and profitable inventions and discoveries. More broadly, he says that the true ends of knowledge are, and I quote, not either for pleasure of the mind or for contentions or for superiority to others or for profit or fame or power or any one of these inferior things, but for the benefit and the use of life, and that they perfect and govern it in charity. In this sense, Bacon can be read as proto-pragmatist, as he connects knowledge to practice and improvement. He can also be read as proto-utilitarian in a loose sense, because he emphasizes the usefulness of knowledge for human beings. However, Bacon's thought contains an ambiguity. On the one hand, he warns against seeking knowledge for superiority over others. Yet, he also gives modern scientific mind one of its major and famous ideas, that knowledge is power. He captures the spirit of empirical science in another famous line, and I quote, "We cannot command nature except by obeying her." The claim here is that if we want power over nature, we get it by patiently studying nature through observations, and we learn natural laws, and then we work within them. However, this ideal of commanding nature also had a darker political afterlife. It became useful to European colonial powers, who often treated nature, land, and colonized people as objects to be studied, classified, and controlled and governed. Empiricism, coming back to empiricism, empiricism prospered in Britain following Bacon's call to ground inquiry in observation. John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume all work within the empiricist domain. Each of them tries in a different way to give a systematic theory of knowledge. Let us begin with John Locke. Locke criticized and rejected innate ideas or innate principles. His argument is philosophical, but it also has a political force. Locke opposes unjust authority and regards innate ideas as authoritative. If some people can claim that certain ideas are inborn in the mind, those ideas can easily be treated as beyond question. Locke hates this kind of appeal to inborn authority. Against Descartes and other rationalists, he argues that if basic truths were completely and really imprinted on the mind, then everyone would know them from the beginning. Children would not need to learn them, but children do need instructions. For Locke, this shows that such principles are not already built into the mind. Instead, he argues that mind begins like a white paper, or what later thinkers call a blank slate or tabula rasa. Its content comes from experience. But Locke's empiricism is not anti-reason. Reason remains important because it organizes, compares, and judges our experience. But reason does not create the basic content of knowledge by itself. In his major work, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Locke gives his theory of knowledge. For Locke, the basic items of thought are ideas. All ideas come from experience, and experience has two sources. The first is sensation, where external things affect our senses and gives us ideas such as color, solidity, motion, sound, and heat. The second is reflection. The mind can look inward and become aware of its own activities such as thinking, doubting, willing, remembering, and comparing. Together, sensation and reflection make up the whole field of human experience. Locke also accepts what is often called the representative theory of perception. This means that we do not know external objects directly as they are in themselves. What we are directly aware of are ideas, and these ideas represent objects in the mind. Locke then differentiates between simple ideas and complex ideas. Simple ideas are basic elements of thought, such as red, cold, sweet, or round. The mind perceives and receives them passively. It cannot invent a simple idea from nothing. Complex ideas, by contrast, are built by the mind through combining, comparing, and abstracting. For example, the idea of a rotten tomato combines several simple ideas such as a bad smell of a tomato, a soft texture, a dark color, and a sour taste. Locke is claiming that thought is compositional. Simple ideas combine into complex ideas, and complex ideas can become a part of a larger structure of thought. Within this framework, Locke introduces his famous distinction between primary and secondary qualities. A quality for Locke is a power in a body to produce an idea in us. Primary qualities such as shape, solidity, motion, and number are really in the object. Secondary qualities such as color, taste, smell, heat, and cold are powers in the objects to produce certain ideas in us. Take an apple. Its shape and solidity belong to the apple itself, but its redness is not sitting inside the apple as redness. Rather, the apple has a physical structure that produces idea of red in a perceiver. Now, Locke defines knowledge as, and I quote, the perception of the connection of an agreement or disagreement and repugnancy of any of our ideas. Let me repeat again. Locke's definition of knowledge is, and I quote, the perception of the connection of an agreement or disagreement and repugnancy of any of our ideas. Here, for Locke, knowledge occurs when the mind clearly perceives agreement or disagreement among its ideas. If the mind perceives this relation clearly, there is knowledge. If it fails to perceive there is a connection between ideas, then we can still believe, but we may not have knowledge. This may sound as if knowledge is trapped inside the mind. Locke accepts that difficulty. For him, knowledge or knowing is a kind of intellectual seeing of a connections among ideas. Locke then explains that knowledge comes in degrees. The highest kind is intuitive knowledge, where the mind recognizes truth at once, as when it sees white is not black, or that triangle is not a square. Next comes demonstrative knowledge, where certainty is reached through reasoning, especially like in mathematics. Finally, Locke adds what he calls sensitive knowledge, which is our knowledge that external physical things exist. This is weaker than intuitive and demonstrative knowledge because it depends on fallibility of the senses. This shows Locke's moderate foundationalism. Some knowledge rests on clear inner certainty. Other knowledge, especially knowledge of the external world, is less certain, but it is still needed. This leads to Locke's view of the limits of human knowledge. Earlier philosophers often claimed to know the real essences of things, that is, the inner nature that makes the thing what it is. Locke thinks that this is usually beyond us. In most cases, we do not know real essences. We work instead with the nominal essences, which are workable definitions and classifications based on observable clusters of qualities. For instance, we may define gold by its color, weight, and other familiar qualities. We may classify it and use it, but that does not mean we know the deepest inner nature of gold. So Locke gives a measured picture. In logic and mathematics, we can reach high certainty because the mind works with clear relations among ideas. In natural philosophy and what we now call empirical science, our knowledge is more limited. We can gain reliable knowledge through careful observations, classifications, and reasoning, but we should not pretend that it gives absolute God's eye certainty about the inner nature of things. This is basically the major criticism that came from Locke of essentialism. Next in the line of the English empiricist is Bishop Berkeley. Like Locke before him and David Hume after him, Berkeley takes experience seriously, but his conclusion is far more radical than Locke's. Berkeley's view is usually called immaterialism or subjective idealism. His claim is that what we immediately know are ideas and that what we call physical objects are stable collections of such ideas. Matter as mind-independent substance is therefore not needed. In this way, Berkeley attacks Locke's view that there is a material substance behind our ideas. For Berkeley, the world or the ordinary world is real, but its reality is the reality of ideas perceived by the minds and ordered by God. With this, Berkeley draws a famous conclusion. Ordinary sensible objects exist only insofar as they are perceived. The tree in the courtyard, the chair in the room, or the book on the desk are stable collections of perceivable qualities, and perceivable qualities exist only in being perceived. This is the thought captured by the slogan, very famous slogan, "To be is to be perceived." Here we can see Berkeley's attempt to answer the question of ontology through epistemology. He is saying that the sensible world is real, but its reality is not reality of the mind independent matter. It is a reality of ideas experienced by stable and ordered way. That order for Berkeley is ultimately grounded in God. Berkeley directly challenges Locke here. Locke says that we are immediately aware of our ideas only, but he still assumes material support behind those ideas, a substance he calls, and I quote, "something I know not what." Berkeley thinks this move creates a doubt. If the real tree is hidden behind idea of tree, then how can I ever compare the idea with the real object? Berkeley's answer is to remove the hidden substance altogether. Therefore, the sensible world is only ordered world of ideas itself, shared by the mind and ultimately grounded in God. Then comes the Scottish philosopher David Hume, who takes the British empiricism to its logical conclusion. He builds on Locke's empiricist project, but he begins with more basic division of mental life. In Treatise of Human Nature, he says that everything present to the mind is a perception. Perception comes in two kinds: impressions and ideas. Impressions are vivid contents of experience, such as sensations, emotions, and passions. Ideas are weaker copies of impressions, which appear when we remember, imagine, or think. This leads to Hume's famous copy principle. That is, every genuine idea must be traceable back to some impression in experience. In other words, for any idea we have, we should be able to trace its origin to some impression in experience. Hume also distinguishes between simple and complex perceptions. A single color, such as red, can be a simple impression, but an apple gives us a complex impression because it includes color, shape, taste, smell, and texture of an apple. Ideas follow the same pattern. Some ideas are simple, while many are complex. Complex ideas are built by the imagination of the mind. A golden mountain is a classic example here. We get the idea of gold and mountain separately from experience. Then the imagination joins them into a complex idea. Hume calls this mind's linking of ideas association. For this, he gives three main principles, namely, first is resemblance, second is contiguity in space or time, and third is cause and effect. Resemblance links ideas because they are alike. Contiguity links ideas because they are near each other. Cause and effect links ideas because one event leads to another. It is this third principle, namely the cause and effect of principle of association, that leads to Hume's most influential argument. Hume notices that human reasoning goes beyond what is directly present. We see dark clouds and then we expect rain. We hear knock on the door and infer someone is at the door. In each case, we move from what is observed to what is not observed. Hume questions what justifies this move, that we move from observed cases to unobserved cases. Our causal reasoning usually has this form. For example, in the past, event A has regularly been followed by an event B. Therefore, when A occurs again, B will occur. But what rationally supports this leap from past observations to future expectations. Hume argues that it cannot be justified by demonstrations or deductive reasoning because the denial involves no contradiction. It is logically possible, however unlikely it is, that nature may change tomorrow. Sun may not rise, bread may not nourish us, a dropped ball may not fall on the ground. So, causal inference is not a matter of logical necessity. This is a very important point. Then, can experience justify our causal reasoning? Hume's answer is no. Any appeal to experience already assumes the future will resemble the past. But that is exactly what we are trying to prove. So, induction cannot be justified by past success without circularity. The problem here is circularity. That is why neither reason nor experience can give induction a final rational foundation. This also explains why Hume says we never perceive any necessary connection between cause and effect. If you release a ball and it falls, you observe one event followed by another. You do not observe necessity itself. No matter how many times the sequence repeats, you never obtain logical certainty that the effect must follow the cause. As Hume says, and I quote, "From the mere repetition of past impressions, even to infinity, there never will arise any new original idea such that of a necessary connection." This is the problem of induction, by far the most interesting problem in my opinion. Bertrand Russell once said that Hume drives philosophy into a dead end because if we begin where Hume begins, we end up in a doubt that is impossible to escape. Russell treated this as an existential problem and said that if we cannot answer Hume, then I quote, "There is no intellectual difference between sanity and insanity." For Hume, causal reasoning is still happening in our lives, but it is based on custom or habit rather than logic. When we repeatedly observe A followed by B, the mind naturally expects B when A appears again. This expectation may be useful and reliable, but it is not a logical proof. So the problem of science becomes more serious. If induction cannot be ultimately proved, how can science justify its causal claims? Hans Reichenbach in 20th century argues that scientific induction may lack an ultimate rational basis, but it can still be defended pragmatically. So Hume ends as one of the great critics of the hope for absolute certainty. We may have certainty in mathematics and logic, but when we turn to the world of experience, to causes and the future, our confidence is never grounded in reason. Historically, this challenge was so powerful that it woke Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, from his dogmatic slumber. One interesting point in this tradition of British empiricism is this. Locke accepted an underlying substance but said it is something I know not what. I'm quoting Locke. He said, "The substance behind our perception is something I know not what." Berkeley then denied matter as a mind-independent substance. Hume went even further and denied soul or self or the I as a fixed substance. What then remained was the world of perceptions, even without any clear underlying substance called matter or soul. In this way, traditional metaphysics was profoundly unsettled by British empiricism. Hume's challenge was first answered by his fellow Scot, Thomas Reid, and later by Immanuel Kant. Let's take Reid first. Reid does not try to defeat Hume within Hume's own framework of impressions and ideas. He thinks Hume's argument is very well if we accept his starting points, but Reid thinks that this starting point rest on a mistaken presupposition. This view, the veil of perception view, that the mind does not know external objects directly, but only knows inner ideas that represent those objects. Reid argues against this. He says that the direct awareness of the external world is basic principle of common life. This is the spirit of common sense realism, which again was later influenced thinkers such as G.E. Moore in 20th century. On causation, which is very important, Reid agrees with Hume on one very important point. We do not see necessity as visible link between cause and effect. This is very important to note. Hume says that we do not see necessity in our experience, and Reid agrees with him. When you drop an apple, you see one event followed by another. You do not see separate event of necessary connection between cause and effect. But Reid critiques Hume's conclusion. He says causation is not merely habit or regularity or constant conjunction. And regularity may help science describe nature, but it is not the full meaning of cause. For Reid, genuine causation requires production, that is, something makes something else happen. And production requires active power. Where do we get the idea of active power? Reid's answer is agency. We first know power through our own action. When we decide to raise my hand and then raise it, I do not merely observe two events in sequence. I experience myself willing and bringing something about. From this first person awareness, we form the idea of active power and then apply it outward to nature. So Reid agrees with Hume that necessity is not visible in experience, but he denies that causation is a matter of habit or pattern. This is a very important critique. The fuller idea of cause involves power, action and production for Reid. Now this important point brings us to Immanuel Kant. Hume had exposed a deep weakness in the old search for certainty, especially regarding causation. Kant took this challenge seriously. He aimed to explain how objective knowledge is possible and how science can make valid claims about universal laws without falling back on a rationalist overconfidence, or for that matter, Humean doubt. Kant thought that this could be done only by changing the basic picture of knowledge. This change is often called Copernican revolution in philosophy. Before Kant, many philosophers assumed that our knowledge must conform to objects. On that view, mind's task, the task of the mind, is to mirror the reality. Kant flips this picture. He argues that objects, as we experience them, must conform to the a priori conditions of human cognition. Let me repeat that again. Kant argues that the object must conform to the a priori conditions of human cognition. In other words, the mind is not merely a passive receiver of impressions, as in the case of Hume and others. It actively contributes to its own making of the experience. It actively contributes its own structure that makes the experience possible. Kant's revolution matters because it tries to resolve a long conflict between rationalism and empiricism. From Plato onwards, rationalism has argued that genuine knowledge, especially certain knowledge, must be a priori. Empiricism, inspired partly by Aristotle and later by the rise of modern science in modernity, argued that our knowledge of the world begins with observation. Rationalism pointed to mathematics as the model of absolute necessity in knowledge. Empiricists pointed to the advance of natural science through experiment. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant responded with a synthesis of rationalism and empiricism. He argued that our knowledge begins with experience, but not all knowledge comes from experience. Experience alone cannot explain the necessity and universality that mathematics and natural science appear to contain. Knowledge arises through the cooperation between what the mind receives and what it contributes to the experience. Mind's faculty of sensibility gives us intuition structured by space and time. The intuition alone is not yet knowledge. The mind must also organize what it is given in the intuition. The faculty that performs this organizing work is the understanding. The understanding organizes experience through built-in a priori concepts, which Kant calls categories. To understand Kant's epistemology, imagine sensory input as water flowing without a fixed shape. Now imagine an ice tray with its fixed molds. The water takes the shape of the cubes in the ice tray because the tray tries to give that a form because it has that form. Similarly, Kant argues that we receive flow of raw sensation. William James later called this flow of sensation, and I quote, blooming, buzzing confusion. The mind then gives structure to this sensory manifold. It turns the scattered input into an ordered experience of objects and events. This organized world of experience is what Kant calls phenomenal world. It is the world as it appears to us. It is in our appearance. But Kant also argues that things may exist as they are in themselves, behind the perception, behind our appearance, independently of the way human beings experience them. This is the nominal world, or the thing in itself, or Ding an sich. And this distinction sets the limits on knowledge. This point is very important. Kant claims that human knowledge cannot go beyond possible experience. It must remain within the appearance in the phenomenal world. Knowledge requires both sensible intuition and the concepts provided by the understanding. The critique of pure reason is Kant's attempt to map these limits of human knowledge. It questions what we can legitimately know and warns reason against making knowledge claims about God, freedom, and the soul as a substance beyond possible experience. Let me repeat that again. Kant here is warning the reason against making knowledge claims about God, freedom of the will, and the soul as a substance beyond the possible experience. When reason goes beyond its proper limits, namely when it goes beyond the phenomenal world, Kant says it fails to give us the proper knowledge because it falls into transcendental illusion. This is the mind's powerful tendency to treat ideas beyond experience as if they were objects we can know. This is why traditional metaphysics produces grand claims and equally grand contradictions. Kant's warning is that once reason tries to move beyond possible experience, beyond the phenomenal world, it begins to produce claims that may feel compelling, but they lack proper grounding. As he says, and I quote, human reason has a natural propensity to overstep all these boundaries, and the transcendental ideas produce, and I quote again, irresistible illusion and deception by which one can hardly resist. He writes that in Critique of Pure Reason. Now we can see Kant's answer to Hume on causation, again bringing back Hume here. Kant accepts that necessity is not seen in experience. He accepts like Reid accepts. We see one event followed by another, but we do not see the necessity connection itself. However, Kant rejects Hume's conclusion that necessity is only habit. Again, very similar to Reid. For Kant, though, causality is an a priori category of understanding rather than learned through experience. It is one of the conditions, a priori condition, that makes the knowledge of the experience possible, or it makes the experience an ordered experience. This is why Kant thinks Newtonian science can claim universal laws. He was very influenced by Newton, by the way. The causal order of nature is possible because experience itself is already organized through the category of causality. Kant writes the heart of this point like this: if A is the cause of B, then B must follow from it necessarily and in accordance with an absolutely universal law, and the strict universality of the rule is therefore not any property of empirical rules. Let me repeat that again. I just quoted Kant. Kant writes that if the event A is the cause of B, then B must, and I quote, follow from it necessarily and in accordance with absolutely universal rule, and the strict universality of the rule is therefore not any property of empirical rules. So, the contrast with Hume is very clear here. Hume says that necessity is not found in experience, so it must come from habit, custom. Kant argues opposite. Kant argues that necessity is not given by experience because it is a part of the structure that makes experience of an ordered world possible. Kant's theory of knowledge is deeply tied to Euclidean geometry and Newtonian physics. For Kant, space and time are a priori forms of human intuition. Those space and time are provided by the mind, he says. Euclidean geometry seemed to show the necessary structure of space, and arithmetic seemed to express the order structure of time. On this basis, Kant argued that mathematics is synthetic a priori. It gives us necessary knowledge, but it is not analytic. However, this Kantian picture came under pressure in the 19th and 20th centuries. First, after the development of non-Euclidean geometry, and later through Einstein's theory of relativity. Here, Einstein became crucial. He challenges two major modern methods of grounding knowledge, that is, simple induction and strict deduction. He rejects naive empiricism because fundamental principles of physics are not simply read from observation. As he writes in his Physics and Reality in 1936, and I quote, "There is no inductive method which could lead to fundamental concepts of physics." But he also rejects strict rationalist deduction because mathematical elegance or formal coherence does not itself guarantee truth about nature. A theory may be deductively rigorous, but it still fails as physics if the concepts do not answer to the experience. In his lecture, Geometry and Experience in 1921, Einstein contrasts the older view of geometry with the modern view, namely the Euclidean view to the non-Euclidean view. On the older view, the geometrical axioms were treated as self-evident expressions of a priori knowledge. On the modern view, on the other hand, axioms are free creations of the mind. And once those axioms are applied to physical space, they must be tested through experience. So Einstein's claim is mathematical principles may be certain within the formal system of mathematics, however, they are not guaranteed to describe physical reality a priori. Reason constructs the framework, but experience determines whether the framework corresponds to nature. With this, we can conclude the modern enlightenment and move to the 19th and 20th century. In the 19th century, pragmatism took shape in the United States. If we want to understand the spirit of pragmatism, then this scholarly phrase is useful. Pragmatism can be understood as, and I quote, a critical study of first prejudices. Pragmatism's major classical figures were Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. These are the classical pragmatists. All were shaped by Darwin's theory of evolution. James was the one to make this philosophy famous, but his version differed so much from Peirce's, who was the founder of pragmatism, that Peirce later renamed his own view as Pragmatism, partly to protect it from misunderstanding because it differed from Peirce's. C.S. Peirce rejected Cartesian search for absolute certainty and defended fallibilism of humans. For him, inquiry begins not with absolute doubt, but with the beliefs and assumption that we actually have. His pragmatic maxim says that to understand a concept, we must understand its practical effects. For example, to understand hardness is to understand what hard things does in practice, such as it resists pressure, it resists cutting and scratching. James developed pragmatism in more practical and existential direction. He asked what difference a belief makes when you live by that belief, and he famously said, and this is a very famous quote, and I quote, "The true is the only expedient in the way of our thinking." Critics of James such as Bertrand Russell in 20th century worried that this made truth too much close to usefulness. If truth becomes only what works, then some even of our comforting beliefs such as Santa Claus exists may appear true simply because it is useful, namely in the case of children. John Dewey, the last major classical pragmatist, treats thinking is not as mirror of reality. He also criticizes Descartes in this sense, but he treats thinking as a tool for dealing with the problems of the world. This is why his view is often called instrumentalism. For John Dewey, knowledge is warranted assertability, a claim accepted when it has survived inquiry and supports the solution of some problem. Now, Dewey is also very important in academics all over the world in some cases. Dewey also deeply influenced Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar at Columbia University. Ambedkar later wrote of Dewey, and I quote Ambedkar here, "I owe all my intellectual life to him. He was a wonderful man." This shows that pragmatism did not remain only an American movement. Through Ambedkar, Dewey's ideas also entered intellectual and political life of modern India. At the dawn of 20th century, philosophy underwent a methodological shift. Now we are in the 20th century. That methodological shift is known as linguistic turn in analytic philosophy. Michael Dummett, an analytic philosopher, later captures this turn with a maxim, and I quote, "A philosophical account of thought can only be attained through a philosophical account of language." Dummett traces this origin to Gottlob Frege. He is often considered the father of analytic philosophy. And his claim is not historical but methodological. He argues that analytic philosophy was born when philosophers began to treat analysis of language as the primary route to the analysis of thought, because thought becomes philosophically manageable only when it is expressed in a public and shareable form. To see what changed, we can see it by understanding the contrast between earlier philosophy and the linguistic turn. Traditionally, before the linguistic turn, philosophers directed their grand theories of knowledge towards showing how the processes in the mind work to understand the outside reality. This can be shown in the case of British empiricists such as Locke and Hume. Their epistemological theories were often framed in psychological terms. They began with private mental items such as ideas, impressions, intuitions, and then explain how these inner contents connect to the world. This is one reason earlier philosophers often spoke in the language of mental faculties. This was also attributed to Kant when it talks about faculties of intuition and understanding. Those faculties such as sensation, imagination, memory, understanding, and reason, The linguistic turn changes the starting points. Instead of beginning with private mental episodes, it begins with language, especially with the sentences that can be publicly examined, clarified, criticized, or assessed as true or false. This is why linguistic turn is anti-psychologistic. This shift philosophy away from inner mental episodes and towards public linguistic meaning, logical form, and objective standards of validity. After Gottlob Frege helped shift philosophy towards logic and language, it was Bertrand Russell and G. E. Moore who led the way for analytic philosophy to prosper. They were both British. Let us take Bertrand Russell first. Russell draws an important distinction between two kinds of knowledge. First is knowledge by acquaintance, and second is knowledge by description. Acquaintance means direct non-inferential awareness. For example, when I say I am aware of this red patch, or for example, I feel this pain. In this, I am not reaching that claim by way of argument because I am directly aware of the experience. Russell thinks we are acquainted with our present sense data such as immediate visual, auditory, and tactile contents of experience. He also thinks we may be acquainted with the self as a subject of experience and with simple universals such as similarity, before and after, or for example, redness. The argument is that acquaintance is not a grand Cartesian certainty about the whole world. It is the least doubtful layer of experience. While the experience is occurring, at least something is present to our awareness. Notice one thing here. Most of what we generally call knowledge, however, is not knowledge by acquaintance. When I say, for example, Julius Caesar was assassinated, or there is a table in the next room, or for that matter, electrons have negative charge, I am not directly acquainted with Caesar, electrons, or for that matter even the table in the next room. Here Russell says we depend on knowledge by description. A description is a phrase that identifies an object through some condition, such as for example the largest planet in the solar system. The description here works if there is one unique thing that satisfies the condition. So Russell's key point is that descriptive knowledge must be finally anchored in acquaintance. Otherwise, our claims would lose contact with reality. Descriptions allows us to go beyond what we directly meet. In the end, they must connect back to what is immediately given in experience. In his Our Knowledge of the External World, Russell uses this distinction to defend a kind of foundationalism. For him, most secure empirical claims are sense datum claims, such as for example, I am now seeing a circular red patch, I am hearing a high pitched sound, or I feel a sharp pain. These claims concerns what is immediately present in experience. They form the starting point from which more ambitious claims about the external world must be built. This is why Russell proposes a characteristic formula of empirical knowledge, and it is as follows. Empirical knowledge of material objects is equal to sense data plus logical construction. So, on Russell's view, the table in the next room is a logical construction built from stable patterns of actual and possible experience. This is Russell's foundationalist move. Acquaintance gives the minimal foundation, and ordinary talk about the external world is rebuilt from that foundation through logical construction. Next in our line is G. E. Moore. He was Russell's colleague and a friend and a fellow founder of analytic philosophy. He is best known for his attack on Hegelian idealism that dominated much of British philosophy at that time. The idealist background included figures like F. H. Bradley, J. M. E. MacTaggart, and Bernard Bosanquet. I may be saying that wrong. Russell later described this break in his book My Philosophical Development when he wrote, and I quote, "It was towards the end of 1898 that Moore and I rebelled against both Kant and Hegel." In his famous essay, The Refutation of Idealism, Moore attacks the idealist view that reality is fundamentally mind dependent. Moore defends a common sense realism in which tables, hands, trees, and other ordinary objects are not merely mental constructions. We really do think about and perceive a world that exists independently of our thoughts. This is very important. This shows that Moore was, in fact, influenced by Thomas Reid. In this way, Moore tries to restore the dignity of everyday knowledge against a metaphysical system that treat it as illusion, appearance, and something less than fully real. Moore then recognizes a problem with direct realism. If perception gives a direct contact with objects, if the perception is giving us the direct contact with the objects, then how do we explain illusion, hallucination, or for that matter error? This problem led Moore, at least for some time, towards sense datum theory of perception. But this move has a cost. Once we say that we are directly aware of only the sense data and we directly know only the sense data, the external world can begin to look hidden behind a veil that is of perception. And that reopens the door for skepticism. Moore does not like this. Moore's most influential reply to that doubt comes later, especially in his essay, A Defense of Common Sense. There, Moore grants an important point. Philosophers may debate theories of perception such as direct realism, indirect realism, or phenomenalism for a long time, he says. It may be hard to prove which theory is correct, he says. But Moore denies that this destroys ordinary knowledge. We may not have final theory of how knowledge works, but that does not mean we know nothing. The skeptic demand too much, he says. The skeptic says, in effect, unless you can solve every deep problem about perception, you cannot know ordinary things. Moore answers that this demand gets the order wrong. Moore makes this strategy clearer in Proof of an External World. He raises one hand and says, here is one hand, and then raises other and says, here is another. From this, he concludes that at least two external objects exist and therefore external world exists. Moore's point will not satisfy every skeptic here. His move is to shift burden of proof. He thinks he has a better reason to believe that he has two hands than to accept a skeptical argument saying he cannot know this. So the skeptic must show why an abstract argument against knowledge is more credible than the ordinary knowledge what we already have. So Moore stands with common sense. These ordinary certainties such as I have a body or earth existed before I was born are called Moorean facts. Moore's point is that any philosophical theory of knowledge must respect these ordinary truths, not explain them away. Next comes logical positivism. This is very interesting. That is the philosophy of Vienna Circle in the 1920s and 30s. Important figures of these movements included Carnap, Neurath, Schlick, and A.J. Ayer. A.J. Ayer was the one who made this famous in the English-speaking world. Logical positivism continued the older positivist attack on metaphysics. Like Auguste Comte in the 19th century, the logical positivist wanted philosophy to stay close to science and reject empty metaphysical and theological speculation. But the Vienna Circle gave this project a new and linguistic form, and that is a logical form they gave. Their concern was not mainly politics or social theory, as in the case of Comte. Their concern was logic of science and the meaning of language and the limits of knowledge. Their central idea was verification principle. According to this principle, a statement is cognitively meaningful only if it is either empirically verifiable through experience or true by logic and definition. Statements of mathematics and logic are meaningful because they are analytic or tautological. Statements of natural science are meaningful because they can be tested through observation. But the statements that cannot be tested in experience and are not true by logic alone do not state genuine facts. This is why the logical positivist rejected much of traditional metaphysics, theology, and speculative philosophy as cognitively meaningless. They just considered those as meaningless. Those are useful for them, but those are meaningless for them. Their treatment of ethics, aesthetics, and religion was also very radical. They did not say that such language is useless, but they denied that it states facts as scientific language does. In A.J. Ayer's emotivist version, for example, moral claims express attitudes, approvals, disapprovals, or emotional reactions rather than facts about the world. A major criticism of logical positivism and its verification principle came from Karl Popper. Popper argued that science cannot be understood mainly through verification. The reason here is logical. A theory may predict an observation, and the observation may occur, but this does not prove the theory is true. This may sound counterintuitive, but the logical form makes the problem clear, and it is as follows. Let's take a premise 1. If P, then Q. Let's take premise 2. Q. In conclusion, therefore, P. This is not a valid form of reasoning. It commits the fallacy of affirming the consequent. The mistake is to think that because predicted result occurred, the theory that predicted it must be true. Take a simple example to understand this further. If it is raining, then the streets must be wet. The streets are wet, therefore it is raining. Notice that conclusion here is not following from the premises. The streets here may be wet from rain, but they may also be wet because of someone else is washing them. So the observation fits the theory, but it does not logically prove the theory. For Popper, this shows that positive observations cannot finally verify scientific theories. Popper therefore shifts the focus from verification to falsification. A scientific theory, he says, must make bold conjectures. Let me repeat that again. For him, the scientist makes more and more bold conjectures. It must tell us, the scientific theory must tell us what should happen if the theory is true, and more importantly, what would count against it. It does not matter whether the theory first comes from observation or imagination, for that matter even a dream. What matters here is whether the theory can be tested. Here Popper is deeply influenced by Einstein. A theory here is scientific not because it can be conclusively verified, as in the case of logical positivism, but because it can in principle be refuted by experience. The logical form of that argument is this. Premise 1 again, if P then Q. Premise 2, not Q. Conclusion is therefore not P. This is valid form of reasoning. That is called modus tollens. For example, if a theory says that planet must appear at a certain place and at a certain time, and careful observations shows that it does not appear there, then the theory faces a serious problem. In this way, Popper argues that, and I quote, rationality of science lies not in its habit of appealing to empirical evidence in support of its dogmas, but solely in its critical approach. For us, therefore, science has nothing to do with the quest for certainty or probability or reliability. We are not interested in establishing scientific theories as secure or certain or probable. Conscious of our fallibility, we are interested in criticizing them and testing them, the theories, in the hope of finding out where we are mistaken, of learning from our mistakes, and if we are lucky, of proceeding to better theories. Now, one of the most important developments in the 20th century of epistemology is the attack on foundationalism. For centuries, many philosophers hoped that knowledge could be built like a building with the secure basic beliefs at the bottom and everything resting above them. Sellars and Quine challenges this picture in the 20th century in different ways. Sellars attacks the idea of the given. Quine attacks the idea that some truths are protected from revision and it is by meaning alone. Together they push epistemology away from foundations and towards a more holistic approach. Sellars' main target is the idea that experience gives us knowledge for free. Many empiricists deny innate ideas but still treat experience as if it contains raw given. The thought here is that if I see red apple or I feel pain, then my mind is directly in touch with something known independently of my other beliefs. This given is then supposed to provide a foundation of foreknowledge. Now, let me repeat that again. This given in the experience is supposed to provide a foundation for knowledge. Sellars criticizes this. Sensations may cause a belief, but it does not justify a belief simply by occurring. Sensation may be causing our beliefs, but it is not justifying those beliefs, he says. To count as a reason, a claim must belong to a public practice where it can be assessed as correct or incorrect, supported or challenged. For Sellars, therefore, knowledge is a network of claims within the public space of reasons rather than a pyramid built on a bedrock founded on some first principles. Quine makes a parallel attack in his famous Two Dogmas of Empiricism. It's a very famous piece of writing. The first dogma is the analytic and synthetic distinction, the idea that some truths are true by meaning alone and therefore protected from experience. The second is reductionism. The second dogma is reductionism, the idea that each meaningful statement can be tested by its own specific range of sense experiences. Quine rejects both the dogmas because for him science does not test single statements one by one. It tests whole theories, that is, connected systems of beliefs and statements. That is why our beliefs form a web, not a pyramid. In the web of belief, logic and mathematics are at the center, Quine says. These are revisable in principles. The logic and mathematics, those are revisable in principle, but extremely stable in practice because changing them would disrupt too much of the theory as a whole. But no belief is absolutely immune to revision, Quine says. What is stable because it is deeply entrenched, not because it belongs to some untouchable foundation. Let me repeat that again. What is stable, like mathematics and logic, those theories are stable because those are at the center of the web, not because of their some foundations or first principles. This is why he writes that rejecting these dogmas produces, and I quote, a blurring of the supposed boundary between speculative metaphysics and natural science, and also a shift toward pragmatism. Here we can see a broader historical shift in epistemology. To see the shift clearly, compare this with the earlier epistemology. Early modern philosophers often treated ideas, impressions, and concepts as the basic units of knowledge. After Frege, the linguistic turn created a different system. Now, philosophers increasingly treated sentences or propositions as the bearer of meaning and truth. Quine moves beyond both the views. For Quine, neither a single idea nor a single sentence is tested in isolation. The real unit for empirical testing and of the empirical testing is a whole theory, understood as a connected body of claims and inferences. This is why Quine's holism damages the traditional foundationalism. It rejects the idea that beliefs can be justified one by one from a fixed base. Those are the first principles that I was talking about. This also explains Quine's naturalized epistemology. Traditional epistemology sought to justify science by appealing to something more certain than science. Quine is opposing that project again. He argues that we should use science itself to study how human beings form beliefs from the sensory input they get in the experience. Therefore, epistemology becomes continuous with psychology, linguistics, neuroscience, and evolutionary theory, and other such subjects. There is no philosophical court above science, only fallible inquiry carried out within nature for Quine. Richard Rorty later captures this wider anti-foundationalist direction of Sellars and Quine. He writes, and I quote, "I interpret Sellars' attack on givenness and Quine's attack on necessity as crucial steps in undermining the possibility of theory of knowledge." By theory of knowledge, Rorty means the older hope that philosophy can secure knowledge by grounding it on indubitable starting points or first principles. Pragmatism likes to call those first principles first prejudices also. Coherentism rejects that hope, as we have seen in Rorty or Quine or Sellars for that matter. It says that belief is justified when it fits within a wider system of beliefs rather than resting on privileged foundations. The aim shifts from an unshakable first principles or foundation to a web of mutual support or criticism or correction or revision. Coherentism can also be read as a response to Agrippa's trilemma. The skeptic says that justification seems to end in one of three ways, either infinite regress or an arbitrary stopping point or some circular reasoning. Foundationalism chooses some stopping point, some bedrock, and calls those beliefs basic beliefs, proved by intuition as self-evident first principles. Coherentism replaces that demand for a linear chain of reasons with justification as a holistic support within a system. Some might say this falls into the problem of circularity. The circularity here is not a single belief proving itself. It is a wider web of mutual support tested by consistency, its power of explanation and fitting within the experience, and how much it can survive criticism. Thus, the aim is no longer an unshakable foundation. It is what Rorty calls, and I quote, "a conception of philosophy which has nothing to do with the quest for certainty." Now, another major challenge to traditional epistemology came in the 20th century from Edmund Gettier and his short but influential paper titled as "Is Justified True Belief Knowledge?" The paper itself points to a new problem. For a long time, common answer to the question what is knowledge was given as justified true belief. This is often traced back to Plato's Theaetetus, though Plato himself does not simply endorse this idea. The idea here is this. Let's say a person who knows that P when P is true. The person believes that P, that is the second condition, and the third condition is person has some justification for believing that P. Gettier's point was that these conditions may be necessary, but they are not enough to count as knowledge. A person can hold a belief that is true and justified and still lack knowledge. Consider his first example. In this case, two people, Smith and Jones, apply for a same job. Smith has a strong evidence that Jones will get the job because company president has told him so. Smith has counted 10 coins in Jones's pocket. This is the second condition. From this, Smith forms the belief, we can call that belief B. The belief B is the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. Now, Smith here is not guessing. His belief seems well supported. He says he has testimony from the company president that he will not get the job, and he has also counted 10 coins in Jones's pocket. So, belief B appears to be justified. Now comes the twist. Belief B turns out to be true, but not in the way Smith thinks, because Jones does not get the job, Smith gets the job. And unknown to him, unknown to Smith, Smith himself has 10 coins in his pocket. These two facts make belief B true. The man who gets the job really does have 10 coins in his pocket. But Smith does not know that he will get the job. He does not know that he himself has 10 coins in his pocket. So, Gettier here is asking whether Smith really knows that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. Smith here has justified true belief, but the belief is true by accident. An accidental truth is not knowledge. After Gettier, epistemologists begin asking questions: what must be added to the justified true belief condition to rule out epistemic luck? One major development was the rise of debate between externalism versus internalism. On an internalist view, justification must be available to the knower as a reason. On an externalist view, on the other hand, knowledge may also depend on factors outside the knower's awareness, such as whether the belief was formed reliably. A famous externalist response came from Alvin Goldman's causal theory of knowledge. Goldman's basic idea is that knowledge requires the right causal link between the fact and the belief. It is not enough for a person to have good reasons. If the belief is true, then the fact that makes it true must also help produce that belief. Now, this is explaining Gettier case in a new form. Smith's belief about the man who will get the job is true because Smith gets the job and has 10 coins in his pocket. But Smith's belief was not produced here by those facts. His beliefs was based on company president's testimony and on his counting of the coins in Jones's pocket. The fact that make the belief true played no role in forming Smith's belief. So, Goldman's view says that Smith has justified true belief, but not knowledge, because the right causal connection is still missing. Now, let me conclude our lecture today. If we step back from the whole history, a pattern begins to appear. Epistemology often begins with the promise of certainty. Plato looks for stable knowledge beyond the changing world of senses. Aristotle seeks first principles on which science can stand. Descartes looks for one indubitable truth, which also calls first principle, from which knowledge can be rebuilt like a building. Locke, Russell, on the other hand, and the other empiricists search for secure starting points in experience and sense data. But again and again, these foundations come under pressure. The skeptics ask where the reasoning ends. Hume shows that causation and induction cannot be justified by reason alone. Immanuel Kant tries to rescue science by showing that the mind contributes the conditions of experience. But even Kant's picture is later challenged by non-Euclidean geometry and Einsteinian physics. In the 20th century, Sellars' attack on the given and Quine's attack on synthetic and analytic distinction and Gettier's cases shows us that justified true belief is not enough for knowledge. The history of epistemology is a repeated movement from ambition for certainty to criticism, and from criticism to more modest account of knowledge. We are still seeking truth, but we no longer seek it as if human beings could stand outside all experience or outside all language, practice, and history. Knowledge becomes fallible, revisable, and public. It is not a final possession of certainty we are looking for anymore. It is an ongoing discipline of inquiry, justification, correction, and responsible belief. With that, I take your leave.